It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
When we are more open with our children from a younger age, it actually benefits them as they get older and they make safer, healthier decisions.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, the author of 6 books about raising happy families and the founder of happyfamilies.com.au. I'm here with my wife and co-host and mum to our 6 daughters, Kylie. And today we're speaking with somebody who is going to help us to better understand all of this stuff that's going on in the media at the moment around our federal politicians, around Chanel Contos and her petition, the whole consent and assault stuff. Her name is Katrina Marson, and Katrina works with the implementation of relationships and sex education more broadly in schools within and within communities here in Australia. A quick note, by the way, while we're not going to be having any explicit discussions, some people might prefer that their children don't listen to what we have to say. And Katrina, you have another job working as a prosecutor in Canberra.
Thank you both so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am a sexual offences prosecutor in my daily job in the ACT. So my work is primarily as a criminal lawyer, but I have a very significant research interest in sexual violence prevention, and particularly the use of relationships and sexuality education as a protective factor in safeguarding sexual well-being. And so I've conducted a Churchill Fellowship where I went to 6 countries across Europe and North America looking at the implementation of relationships and sex ed as a means of safeguarding sexual well-being. And I brought back a lot of lessons from all of those countries into how we might be able to implement that here in this country as a means of looking after our young people.
In the media recently, Katrina, a young girl, Chanel Contos, has demanded that consent education be taught in our school system. Why is it so important for this to happen within the schools?
It's a really good question, and I think what we've seen out of the petition that Ms. Contos has launched is that just the sheer numbers of young people who are drawing the connection between the deficiency in their education around this stuff and the experiences of sexual violence and harassment that they've had. So it's important that we see this kind of education in schools for a number of reasons. And the main one is that through schools you can access most children in the school environment. The other thing is we know that relationships and sexuality education is a specialist subject. We need to make sure it's taught by people who are trained to do so effectively, and we need to make sure that what is being delivered is borne out by the research and the evidence. And so when you're doing it through the school system, there's the capacity to make sure that the teachers are qualified to deliver it, and that we can evaluate and measure what in fact is being delivered, and have a degree of quality assurance there.
So we're talking about needing to educate our children within the school system, but what part do families play in this, Katrina? I mean, there needs to be some collaboration, I would have thought, for us to be able to really work through this.
Yeah, so I'm going to just quickly jump in before you answer, Katrina. Something that I hear time and again on our Facebook page particularly is parents are saying, we don't want this to... well, actually, there's 2 schools of thought. There's some people who are saying, I've got no idea what to say. I need the schools to come in. But then there are others who are saying, teachers are not professionals and it's my job to teach morality and sexuality and respect. It's not up to the schools. It seems like this is a really polarizing kind of topic. So to piggyback on Kylie's question about what role do parents play, how do we actually get this balance right where the state's stepping in and the parents are saying yes or no to that?
It's a really good question, and there are actually a number of aspects to the answer. But to start off with, Kylie, you're exactly right. This is a matter that needs collaboration between the school and the home. As I've said before, you can't silo responsibility to either the school or the home. It needs to be both. And that was really consistent in what I saw overseas. Everywhere I went where they had successful relationships and sexuality education programs, they were very committed to bringing in the home and parents along with that conversation they were having with the young people in the schools. And so, for example, I would see programs where they would, for every lesson they gave to the students, there would be a complementary lesson or not lesson, session, I should say, for the parents beforehand, so the parents would know what was going to be discussed with their young people and what that conversation would look like. And that's not just so that they can have that input, which is, of course, important, but also, just as you've indicated, Justin, for those parents who need assistance or want assistance in how to talk to their young people about this, how to improve their own literacy around these topics, how to know what questions to expect at what ages and how to respond to them. So it's about building up skills across entire communities, not just for the young people and their parents, but everyone, about how we talk about these matters. But coming back to your question about whether these questions or these issues of morality and sexuality belong in the home or whether they belong as something that the state looks after, it's about striking the balance between the two. And what's important about comprehensive relationships and sexuality education is that it is predominantly about access to information that can be used to protect sexual well-being as young people go into that stage of their lives later. And what we know is that the earlier you talk to young people about this in an age-appropriate way, the later they are likely to have their first sexual experiences and the less likely they are to have negative sexual experiences. So that's really important to bear in mind when we're talking about the need to have this conversation with young people and to protect them with it.
So this is fascinating, and it's something that I've always been intrigued by in the research, this idea that when we are more open with our children from a younger age, it actually benefits them as they get older and they make safer, healthier decisions. In just a sec, we're going to quiz Katrina about morality and some of the big ticket items, some of these challenges that parents face as they try to navigate these conversations with their children around consent and sex education. That's coming up next on the Happy Families podcast.
It's the Happy Families podcast.
For a happier family, try a Happy Families membership, because a happy family doesn't just happen. Details at happyfamilies.com.au.
It's the Happy Families podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. And today we're talking with Katrina Marson about sex education and consent in our schools.
Okay, so Katrina, I've received, and I regularly receive, comments from parents who really have big issues with what is taught in schools when it comes to sex education. And there's a couple of things that come up fairly consistently. Number one, there are usually quite conservative parents who will say, I don't want my children being taught all of the gender diversity stuff. They're uncomfortable with some of those aspects that could be taught in this curriculum. Another thing that comes up remarkably regularly is this idea that the mechanics of sex is taught, but not the reality of what it is to lead an intimate life with someone. That is, the emotional intimacy stuff is divorced from the physical intimacy. A third thing that I've been hearing recently since Chanel Contos's petition has been, what's the point in doing sex education and consent anyway? Consent is a low bar, and the kids, it goes in one ear and out the other. As you've travelled the world and as you've dealt with all of these big issues and watched what other countries are doing, what has stood out to you in response to these, not necessarily specifically these issues, but these kinds of issues more generally?
Sure. I think what is consistent between those concerns that you've just listed is that what makes good quality relationships and sexuality education is when it is holistic and comprehensive. So you can't just isolate a discussion about consent away from a discussion about respectful relationships and bodies and puberty and personal boundaries and families. It needs to be embedded in a broader, more holistic education program. That is really important, and that was consistent in every country that I went to. What's important to remember about this kind of education is that it is, certainly in the international sphere, it's been described as a life course intervention that increases the health and well-being of young people. And that's because it can help them expand their knowledge of sexual and reproductive health and rights, but help them develop communication, decision-making, risk reduction skills. They can adopt positive and responsible attitudes towards sexuality. These are the important things that we hope to deliver in any good comprehensive relationships and sexuality education module.
So it sounds like it's exactly the opposite of, I had a couple of people on my Facebook page recently with one of these topics say, we just need to go back to teaching abstinence until you're married. But it sounds like you're you're indicating that the research evidence you've found would be quite contradictory to that.
Yes, it suggests the opposite. And it's important to emphasise the age appropriateness of it. Of course, we're talking about anything that when we're talking to young people about this, it would be done in an age appropriate fashion. But one thing that I would like to highlight is what was consistent overseas is that this was treated as a specialist subject matter. So they had experts who would design these programs, people who understand pedagogy and, behavioural change and using these education methods to, as I say, ensure that we have later first sexual experiences and when those sexual experiences happen, that they are less likely to be negative. Those were the people who were designing these curriculums and helping them to be delivered, or the teachers to be trained to deliver them well. It's not just that someone overseas said to me, Bob from geography can just teach because he's got a spare period. Yeah. So that's certainly something that I think is really important to remember in this conversation, and it's about acting on the evidence about what we know this education is capable of.
This is just a fascinating conversation, Katrina. When I think about the experiences that we've had as parents with our 6 girls, they've been to a number of schools over, a lifetime of schooling for us. We've been to only one school where sex education included parents in the process. And it was such a powerful evening to attend and to be able to, sit side by side with your child and hear the same words and terminology used and, use that as a jumping, use that as a springboard. Thank you. Use that as a springboard to, start and initiate conversations within the home. So this seems to be an area where we're really just, missing the mark with families and children. We want to empower everybody through this process. So if I'm a parent and I don't want my children being a participant or even an author of a petition such as Chanel Contos's one, or having to deal with the appalling actions of predominantly males, but let's not, kind of pick on them too much, that we're seeing in the parliament at the moment. What can I do as a parent? How can I, arm my children, safeguard them and, help them to, develop age appropriately and start to experience, positive relationships with their peers?
Sure. And again, I go back to that point that I made earlier about going to the sort of expert designed material that is out there. There are people who know how to do this well and how to do it effectively. And so I can point you, for example, to the Rutgers Institute in the Netherlands. They are the ones responsible for designing their award-winning program, Spring Fever. So if you search Spring Fever Rutgers, that's RUTGERS, in Google, it will take you there.
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes for sure.
Sure. And then Big Talk Education in the UK is another example. And then if you're wanting to talk about consent, I can point you to the Rape and Sexual Assault Research and Advocacy organisation that I'm part of, rasara.org. They have a consent toolkit which includes sort of how you might discuss the issue of consent with young people specifically. But again, I'd say that conversation needs to be part of a more broader, holistic discussion about respectful relationships and sexuality. And that's something that, as I say, if you search out, for example, sexual health and family planning organisations often have good materials on their websites. There are people out there who have invested a lot of research and expertise in this, and they do have some really good products out there for parents.
Well, Katrina, I like what you've done, and I'm frustrated by what you've done, because what you've essentially said is, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but here are some really great resources from people who are excellent at it. And that's probably, it's one of those fast is slow, but slow is fast things. And I think that it's probably the right way to go. So it's been a delight to talk with you. Thank you so much for your expertise and the things you've shared.
Thanks for having me.
That's Katrina Marson. She works in the implementation of relationship and sex education in schools and within communities, and also works as a lawyer in the ACT. What a fascinating discussion. If you have enjoyed the podcast, we always love it when you leave ratings and reviews to help others to discover the podcast. 5-star ratings and reviews at Apple Podcasts do that. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Our executive producer is Craig Bruce. If you'd like more information about how to make your family happier, you can check out the show notes. That's where we'll link to everything Katrina's talked about, or visit happyfamilies.com.au.